For the last year or so, virtually all of your traditional Catholic commentators who touch church news and current events have reported stories of traditional Latin Mass communities being given extensions for the implementation of Traditionis Custodes. We've reported that since the months after Traditionis Custodes was implemented, that there were being extensions being requested and that extensions were sometimes given. Those extensions have always been given as 2 to 3 years in length, meaning the Vatican, when allowing for more mass offerings in a diocese than is allowed by Traditionis Custodes, and when allowing for exceptions to the rules, generally give the diocese 2 to 3 years to implement certain aspects of that diabolical document. These usually involve essentially re educating traditionalists to love all the great things the Novus Ordo has done to the church. This has been pretty consistent since about the fall of 2021, which is also why some news has come out that some dioceses have been told not to extend those permissions, such as a few cathedrals in the US, Australia, and in the UK most recently. But another story about the liturgy has been talked about since even before that time. See, way back in 2019, in the before times, as people sometimes call it, the Pan Amazon Synod was held in October 2019 at the Vatican. We all saw the Pachamama debacle unfold in real time and the consequences that came from it afterwards. And yes, I am blaming Pope Francis allowing the worship of a pagan idol for the events of 2020. But the Pan Amazon Synod had, like all synods, issued a document that was put out at the end with recommendations for Pope Francis to inflict on the church. Many of those recommendations have been ignored so far, like the very pro body debate, if you remember that. That was the idea that you could solve the vocations crisis in Central America and South America by allowing older married men to become priests, which was just a way of trying to crack the door open to destroying the big T tradition of unmarried clergy for the Latin Rite, an issue that is actually so horribly misrepresented by modernists that you'd think having unmarried priests was something Pope St. Pius X decided by executive fiat to inflict on the church, because that's how they talk about it. Thankfully, that suggestion did go away, but there was another recommendation, and for 5 years, it's been brewing behind the scenes. So we're going to start here just with the headline before I explain to you some of the dangers of what's being talked about. The headline is from LifeSite. New Amazon Rite of the Mass to enter 3-year experimental phase. The Amazon Rite, inspired by local traditions and customs in the region and proposed at the 2019 Amazon Synod, will enter a 3-year experimental phase in late 2024, a Vatican theologian has said. Now, as many have pointed out, it does seem that the Vatican really does like its 3-year phases for all things liturgy. We have 3 years, sometimes another extension given in some dioceses, to get all those meanie-headed, rigid trads, neo-clericalists, neo-Pharisees, back to the kumbaya group hug norm that the rest of the church is in, while we pay lip service to how the ordinary form of the Mass needs to be said with due reverence and respect, but then literally nothing is ever done to enforce that by the Vatican, while they crush all opposition to the preconciliar faith. And in the same way, they fabricate a new version of the Mass in committee over the course of 5 years. I will say that that probably took as long as it did because of the events of 2020 and the chaos that it caused for church governance. But they fabricated this thing out of committee, and now they're going to give it a 3-year try phase. I will say this much in defense of what they're doing. It would have been nice if there had been a trial phase of the Novus Ordo in 1970 instead of just replacing every mass on the planet in the Latin Rite with this new committee feet created fabrication that then has had been tinkered with for 40 years since then. It'd have been great if they'd actually done, you know, this. But there are dangers to this. You see, the church in Latin America has always had local cultural accretions in the liturgy and in the life of the church more broadly. There'd be local cultural influences on the Mass and things happening in the church, just like it's had everywhere. You see this especially in Mexico, where local tradition influences things like hymns and other similar kinds of things in ways that have been long been accepted by Rome, going back well before Vatican II. We're talking the aftermath of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Okay, there were things about the culture that were allowed to be expressed in the Mass to a certain degree, and it was generally tolerated and even accepted by Rome as not a bad thing because they didn't conflict with the faith. Though some of those influences after Vatican II certainly might have, Day of the Dead, for instance, is a thing that you see a lot of priests telling people not to embrace. Why this now, though? And I'm going to ask you that question because the Latin rite of the church, this is where your traditional mass. What do you think? What mass do you think they were hearing in Mexico City in the aftermath of Our Lady of Guadalupe? It was a pre-Trent version of the traditional Latin mass, almost certainly, or it was a Dominican rite mass, or maybe some other uh, religious monks offering their own liturgy, because a lot of the monastic groups have their own variation on the traditional Latin mass, the Dominicans and Carmelites most famously. But that was what they were hearing. That was what Archbishop Lefebvre's Holy Ghost Fathers in the 30s and 40s and 50s in Africa were using as an evangelization tool. So I'm just throwing this out there that the Mass is the Mass, and you don't need to create some pandering new version of it to bring souls to Christ. But then again, the bishops behind the Pan Amazon Synod all bragged about how they'd never, ever baptized a local indigenous person, and they never would. So conversions aren't what they're going for here. Let's look at the two concepts you need to understand before this proposal will make any sense, and why it's just another danger to souls inflicted by Pope Francis on the church. The first is a concept called syncretism. If you're not familiar with syncretism, I have an article here that kind of goes over some of the influence of syncretism here. I'm just going to focus on this section here, but it's one thing to retain non-harmful elements of pre-Christian culture and hold on to them as Catholics. The church has always talked about how local cultures are to be prized and how they are perfected through the gospel and everything else. Catholic Church has never been against local cultures and customs. It's quite another thing, though, to incorporate your pre-Christian spirituality into the Catholic faith. That is generally called syncretism, and it's not a new problem in the post-conciliar era. Usually we see this in the ecumenical dialogue movement. Remember that Abu Dhabi Abrahamic Faith Worship Center from a few years ago? 2019, 2020 was when a lot of that talk was going on. Bishop Schneider had some rather spicy things to say about it. I know I'd gotten some serious trouble with YouTube trying to cover that story. But that's the blatant form of syncretism, which is really just religious indifferentism on nitro. That's all it is. See, this is an article from EWTN describing some syncretistic practices we've seen among essentially the eternal hippie demographic in the church in North America, because they've been pushing this stuff in North America for decades. This section defines the dangers of syncretism to the faith and the underlying spiritual attitude about it. Quote, the pervasiveness of this spiritual attitude, much influenced by New Age trendiness, challenges the foundations of our church. At the same time, however, it offers us an opportunity to re-examine those foundations and ask ourselves just what it is that anchors our identity as Catholics. The syncretistic tendency can be defined as the attempt to appropriate ideas and practices from a variety of spiritual traditions without any attempt to discriminate their truth or value on the basis of Catholic faith. One way in which the equality and compatibility of various religions is justified is by subsuming their various dimensions under generic categories. So the writings of different religions are all put on the same level by being labeled sacred. Similarly, different deities are subsumed under the general category of the transcendent, and various rituals are all considered to serve the same function of contacting and establishing unity with the transcendent. Pause here. You kind of see this with for whatever cedar meals. I don't know why it is that during the Passover Catholics think that they should be doing it. It's actually explicitly prohibited by the Catholic Church for Catholics to participate in such things, because that ritual ceremony is done in anticipation for the coming of the Messiah, because those who have that practice don't believe the Messiah has come yet. And if you are a Christian of any stripe, you believe fully that Jesus Christ was the Messiah and is the Messiah because he still lives. So why would you participate in something that anticipates the first coming of the Messiah? Right? Some see religion itself as the unifying concept, though only known through the various, quote, religions. Thus, David Stendhal Rast says, religion, as I use the term, should be written with a capital R to distinguish it from various religions. All religions find their source in religion. Where religion is institutionalized, it becomes merely a religion. For Stendhal Rast, the content of religion is revealed through our peak experiences. Sound familiar? There, we discover what we mean by God if we want to use that term. We experience that we belong to God. Our true self is the divine self. And I could keep going on that piece. If you want to read the whole thing, it's a very interesting article. I'll have it in my show notes at returntotradition.org not long after this live stream is over. Peak religious experience, this personal experience. You remember Pascendi Dominici Gregis by Pope St. Pius X? I've been presenting uh, sections of it every other weekend on Saturday mornings. Catch up on it if you haven't. A core element of modernism is this internal religious experience. That's what they're doing here. This new liturgy is pure modernism. And the modernists will do all sorts of ridiculous things in the name of personal experiences. There's another concept, and it's called enculturation. Yes, to a degree, enculturation is fine, as I said above, but here's what enculturation is, and you'll see why it's potentially very hazardous to the faith. To understand this, you have to grasp the concept of Christian anthropology. That's the basic concept that says the incarnation of Christ and the establishment of the Catholic Church and its work in the world as an evangelization force on the world stage has led to essentially the improvement of human cultures when they accept Christ and the Church and conform their activities to what they profess to believe. You might be wondering why the world is spinning out of control right now. Well, it's simple. The answer is Christian anthropology, or more accurately, the lack thereof these days. As we de-Christianize the culture changes and becomes, well, more wrapped in diabolical darkness. The more people conform themselves to the saving grace of Christ and live sacramental lives, the closer their cultures get to perfection, and vice versa. It's more complicated than that, obviously, but that's the quick version of it. The danger is that this could lead essentially to a form of relativism, which in this case would mean the Mass is made to not be a Catholic Mass at all, save for some random shoehorning in of a Eucharistic prayer if we're lucky. And I say if we're lucky because there has been talk from the modernists about a new ecumenical Mass to be more welcoming to our separated Protestant brethren. That would include removing the consecration, which then becomes what's the point and how is this any different than what you might see at a Lutheran building somewhere or at a oneness Presbyterian thing? What would be the difference at that point? Now, I will assume in charity that the dicasteries involved in this mess would be smart enough to keep the Mass valid, at least in theory, even if the theology behind the rest of the Mass is total hot garbage. One potential danger of Catholic enculturation is that human cultural values can take precedence over faith and theology. Numerous theologians from across the friendly to the post-conciliar order to the openly hostile to it spectrum of theologians have all said the same thing. And if we are having human cultural values take precedence over faith and theology, that then can distort faith and theology. This can happen when the goal is to convert the faith itself, rather than converting human culture to the Christian faith. The term enculturation is used by Catholic theologians and leaders to describe the process of engaging the gospel of Christ with a specific culture. The goal is to safeguard the gospel's integrity while also being sensitive to different cultural contexts. It's fine to take a gospel story and the lessons of the gospel and then find cultural stories that can be used to teach the point of the gospel as long as you don't distort the gospel in the process. Enculturation is also seen as a process of growth and mutual enrichment that can occur when the gospel encounters a social milieu. It is described as the introduction of cultures into the life of the church and the incarnation of the gospel in indigenous cultures. And now remember that. If the goal is to convert the faith itself, it's a problem, right? Well, what have we heard from the synodalists? Those pushing the synod of synodality. They keep talking about a new synodal church. They keep preaching decentralization, putting local people in control of more aspects of the faith. This manifested in Germany with attempts to put laity in charge of determining who can be bishops and who can be priests and who can be entered into seminaries, as well as laity preaching the gospel and preaching homilies. This decentralization touches even on the liturgy, as you see here. It's the same move, except, of course, you're not allowed to have your traditional Mass. You can't have that kind of decentralization of authority. This new pagan-inspired Mass is just that. It's a new Mass for a new synodal church. And it won't be the last one. It's not even the first one. They experimented with this with the Zaire use. Now, let's finally get to the life summary of this because it's not really long. The highly anticipated and controversial Amazon rite of Mass will enter a 3-year experimental phase later this year, a key theologian has attested. In a new report by Vida Nueva Digital, groundbreaking details were revealed about the proposed Amazon rite of Mass, a fruit of the 2019 Amazon Synod held at the Vatican. While not giving any verbatim quotations, Vida Nueva stated that, quote, the Amazon rite will enter the experimental phase, which will last 3 years until 2028, at the end of 2024. This is going to be tied to the liturgical calendar, which is the calendar the church operates off of. So, in addition to, like probably the bureaucratic side of the Roman Curia operates off fiscal calendars like everybody else in the Western world, but you're going to see this launch at the start of Advent. That's what they're trying to hint at. The news is arguably the most significant development in relation to the Amazon rite since it was proposed back in 2019. Father Agenor Brigenti, Vida Nueva source, serves as the head of the theological team of Latin America and Caribbean Episcopal Council, CELAM, and also the advisor to the Ecclesial Conference of the Amazon, CEMA. These two groups were key for the Amazon Synod. The last time I talked about these groups in any real way, other than the occasional Paca-Mama story, was for the Amazon Synod back in 2019. Brigenti additionally serves as the coordinator of, quote, the process of elaboration of the Amazon rite for the Ecclesial Conference of the Amazon, and advocates for the ordination of women to the diaconate and the priesthood, because of course he does, along with married priests. These days, you're not going to see this issue separate from this issue. They're going to be tied to the hip. You should give some proponents of married Latin rite priests some pause. The influential theologian is a key advisor to the current synod on synodality. You see how the pieces fit together now? These things are not separate. They go together. The Amazon rite is a product of the highly controversial 2019 Synod of Bishops on the Amazon, or the Amazon Synod. Among the many proposals raised by the Amazon Synod in its final document are the opening of the clerical state to women and admitting married men to the priesthood, in an attempt to make the church more appealing to Catholics in the region. You want to know why you have to make the church more appealing to Catholics in South America now? It's because the bishops of South America have stopped preaching the gospel for the most part. And because of North American Protestant missionaries going down to South America, believing fully that no one has ever heard the gospel there before, and preaching the gospel to convert souls. Sometimes adopting the imagery of Our Lady of Guadalupe to bring souls out of the Catholic Church into their false little communities. They do that. That's why. They're trying to bring those people back, and they think that they can do so with this stuff. Instead of giving them the same faith they always had, preaching the gospel, doing it boldly, as if they believed what they were saying. Additionally, based on the Second Vatican Council's defense of liturgical pluralism, that's a red flag term, the Amazon Synod's final document called for a rite for native peoples, which would be based on their worldviews, traditions, symbols, and original rites that include transcendent, community, and ecological dimensions. Remember what we talked about with all religions being subsumed in that EWTN article? This Amazonian rite would express the liturgical, theological, disciplinary, and spiritual heritage of the Amazon, which would assist the work of evangelization. Details have since been scarce on what the rite might look like. However, Pope Francis has suggested it could be formulated in line with the Zaire rite, which has been used in the Democratic Republic of the Congo since 1988. I know some people immediately feel relief. This is not that big of a deal. No, this is a problem that's been in the church since after the council. In a preface to a 2020 book on the Zairean rite, Francis wrote that the rite, quote, is considered an example of liturgical enculturation. One feels that in the celebration, according to the Zairean rite, a culture and spirituality animated by religious songs with African rhythm, the sound of drums and other musical instruments, vibrate, which constitute a true progress in rooting the Christian message in the Congolese soul. It's a joyful celebration, he commented. Pope St. Pius X wrote an encyclical on liturgical music. It's on my channel. It actually expressly bans percussive instruments in the Mass. At one point in time, even pianos were banned in Mass, even though piano's pretty calm in comparison to this nonsense. That's where we are. That's where we are now, folks. All in the name of unity, unity, unity. Key takeaway here is that this isn't going to look like a Catholic Mass. Instead, it's going to involve actual worship of creation. And that's not that surprising. That whole care for the common home stuff came from Latin America. It's a key feature of late 20th and 21st century liberation theology. Pope Francis has never blatantly endorsed liberation theology. In fact, he's actually said some things against it, but he has adopted many of its assumptions. Most of Pope Francis's most vocal South American supporters admit that he's not a liberation theologian, but they do call him a liberating theologian. That's a bit like being a member of a political party as a legislator, but working with the opposition party almost as much as you do your own party. Political analogies are always rough for church news and events, but in this case, it does sort of work. Pope Francis is very friendly to liberation theology, and you might even say he's very big among liberation theologians. He's gone on the record to say in 2019 that he believes fears about liberation theology were overblown. Okay. And this article from Crux will make some people uncomfortable as I go over it, because if you want to know how we got here, here's your headline. From 2019, in the months leading up to the Amazon Synod, Pope Francis reflects on changed attitude toward liberation theology. Yeah, you're going to see a name here as helping make Pope Francis embrace liberation theology. It's going to make many of you very uncomfortable. Time, experience, and reflection have purified liberation theology and its attempts to make clear what the gospel says about social injustice, Pope Francis said. Today, we old people laugh about how worried we were about liberation theology. The Pope told 30 Jesuits from Central America when he met them January 6, 2019, in Panama during World Youth Day. Let me tell you a funny story, he told the Jesuits. The one most persecuted, interesting word about that to use there, Dominican Father Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian, concelebrated Mass with me and the then prefect of the Congregation of Doctrine and Faith, Cardinal Gerhard Mueller. And it happened because Mueller himself brought him to me as his friend. If anybody had said back then that the prefect of the CDF would have brought Gutierrez, one of the leading figures of liberation theology, to concelebrate with the Pope, they would have taken him for being inebriated, the Pope told the Jesuits. I can go on. I don't think I need to. Pervasive problem in the church, manifesting itself in a new liturgy that expressly is influenced by the transcendent natures of the local cultures. That flies in the face of Christian anthropology. It should be soundly rejected by every believing Catholic. It won't be. That's where we are now. Patrick Parson says, full on apostasy, there's no attempt to evangelize and convert them. There is simply capitulation. If you want to destroy religion, this is how you do it. Yeah. Again, you're going to see a theme in this week's videos. And that theme is apostasy. You might say that's a running theme on the channel, but there's a theme, including some of the signs that we might not be aware of, some of the theological underpinnings to it. Check out today's news video when it goes live. Does anybody have any thoughts on all of this happiness before we wrap this up? Let me know in the live chat if you do. All right. Dodetto says, all of this is intentional. No pope can be this ignorant of the canon. Bergoglio's Luther 2.0. Man has a statue of Martin Luther in his office. Has a picture of Judas on his wall and has issued commemorative stamps honoring Luther, painting him and I think it was Zwingli or Calvin at the foot of the cross, and reminiscent of images of Our Lady and St. John. Sometimes he tells you what he thinks. Edu says, it's almost like we had a warning from Akita and Fatima about this. Yeah. She says, my FSSP group is holding Mass in an Anglican church. What would I do in this position? I'd ask some questions of your priest. Ask them if the Anglican church has a relic in its altar stone, or if he has something else to do. Some basic things. I'm not comfortable with that personally. This is also part of the move you're seeing with Anglicans being the conservative dioceses that did not ordain the ladies being invited to come back to the Catholic Church without actually giving up any of their theological problems. You're seeing that talk behind the scenes. I've reported on that recently. Burke is getting more vocal. I haven't seen him be vocal in a while. If you've seen him publish anything recently, I've been checking his website. I haven't seen anything from him. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.